Hi, everybody. Welcome to our last session before the summer holidays begin, where we are going to be talking about tapping into China's trade opportunity through the various trade channels that exist. We're going to be looking at e-trade, cross-border e-commerce, traditional trade, and retail. The goal for today's session is to give you an idea of the types of business models that can be created in China, what you can actually do, how you can grow, how you can scale up. And we'll also end today's session looking at 4 different case studies of clients of mine and what they've gone through throughout their China journey in terms of adding all of these different aspects into their China business model. So let's get cracking on today's session. Now, how do we begin? Everybody's going to have a different stage in their China journey. Some people might be very much at the China market entry stage. Others might be actually further along, having already transacted in China. Now, the issue right now is with the pandemic, with the borders being shut, there is pretty much a consensus that people can't push the green light for their China business because they can't be physically on the ground in China. And they can't progress negotiations and all of that. I want to personally say that's absolute rubbish. I actually acquired around between 20 and 25 clients last year. It was a phenomenal year. And still to this day, there are people responsible for the China business that have never set foot in China, never actually shook hands with the people they've hired in China. So it's just to say that it is doable. You can progress in China. You can set up your business model without actually being there. The other issue around how do I begin is not really knowing what you can and cannot do in the Chinese market. And I always say that knowledge is power. The more you know of what is possible, the more you can actually create a strategy that fits you and fits your commitment level, your financial resources, your human resources, i.e. the time you have available to explore the Chinese market and scale up in China. So how do I begin? It really starts from having this knowledge level and not having this fear about going into China. So today is actually a presentation of just pictures, business models, and whatnot. There's very little writing. What I want to talk about very briefly right now is the 3 forms of trade that exists in China. There's cross-border e-commerce, there's wholesale distribution, and there's traditional retail. And I want to give you a little bit of an understanding of what we're seeing in the market today, not in the past. The pandemic has pivoted a lot of this in the last 2.5 years. So I want to explain what we are seeing in the market and how companies are pivoting their businesses based on this pandemic and based on what is easy to kick off the business in China. Okay. Again, we're talking about trade, so it's not service related. This is very much a presentation around buying and selling of goods. Okay, so cross-border e-commerce is right now the #1 model that is used by market entrants into China. This is not the cheapest form of market entry. Why? Because you as a brand still have to take on the responsibility and the financial aspects of setting up your flagship stores, of dealing and paying TPs, working with logistics providers. It is still intensive. It's not that you can just delegate this to others, but it is actually the #1 solution for brands to say, I'm going to kick off the business in China with the cross-border e-commerce model. Why? I don't have to register any of our products if it does require registration in China. I can decide to do the drop shipping model, which means actually there's no inventory in China. If there's an order placed, it goes directly from the HQ. Or as the volume increases, I can keep a certain amount of inventory in the bonded zone in China and then sell from there. The cross-border e-commerce model is a fantastic first step, exploring China and doing your market research. It is expensive. It costs money to set up the flagship store. There are commissions to be paid to the TPs. You do have to pay your logistics providers. And it might not give you a full idea of the market opportunity because you're still using the cross-border e-commerce websites like Tmall Global, JD Global, versus using the domestic sites that are more accessible to the Chinese consumers. But this is a much better approach than thinking about translating your website into Chinese and assuming that Chinese consumers in mainland China are going to find your website that is potentially hosted in the US, hosted in the UK, hosted in Australia. You're not going to get the same resonance and feedback. Don't forget, in this model, you are still going to have marketing expenditure available to promote your flagship stores and the products and SKUs that are on those flagship stores. So by all means, I do not want to say that this is the cheapest methodology. It is not. It is currently the simplest methodology because you are not reliant on distributor introductions and not meeting people face to face. You're just meeting the service providers that are fulfilling the service versus creating a strategy plan with a distributor who potentially wants to take your business abroad, and expand it within China. Very different conversations. So again, for those that have just popped in, cross-border e-commerce currently is really the #1 methodology or business model, if you will, of companies that are looking to sell their products to consumers. Please do create your budgets around this. It is not a cheap methodology or business model. It also is labor intensive in terms of the follow-up that you have to do to make sure that it works. The other form of business model is wholesale, i.e. utilizing sales agents, utilizing distributors, going the licensee route. It's using these forms of intermediaries that are going to purchase product from you with the hope that through their network, they are going to sell to the public, to the consumers in China. Now, the problem with the wholesale is if you are in a product category that requires product registrations, this has to happen. Either they will have to have the license or the know-how in terms of how to do that. Keep in mind that if they register your products in China, they are also the owners of that registration because you will not have an entity yet in China, right? You're outsourcing this whole trade aspect to these distributors, sales agents, licensees. So it is weighing out the cost, the pros and cons ultimately of what a distributor is going to offer to you. Do you want to have the mindset of saying, I just want to delegate? A distributor is interested in my products. They have told me that they can sell everything within 1 to 2 weeks. You have to check whether that's real or not, right? You have to vet them, understand them, do your due diligence on them to really check. What you don't want to happen with distributors or licensees or whomever is that they tarnish your image. Because ultimately you will not have transparency between the distributor and the consumers. You don't know what price point they're selling at. You don't also know necessarily what marketing strategies they're going to be using to promote your products and your brand. So it also comes down to control. With the cross-border e-commerce methodology, the business model, you have control. You're going to be using media agents. You're going to be working with TPs that are just fulfillment centers. They obviously will hopefully give you suggestions on how to tweak your flagship stores, but they will never take on the full responsibility of your flagship store. Okay? They want to create something where it's a win-win situation where you're still interested, invested in the cross-border e-commerce model, and they themselves will earn more money from you if you're working together to increase your sales of products, the volume of the business, basically. In distribution, it's different. The distributor is going to take on the full liability of your products and your brand, and they have a strategy on how they're going to sell. And maybe you do not know how they're going to actually execute that and implement that. And with the fact that the borders are shut, or if you're willing to do 10 days of quarantine and potentially get caught in the lockdowns, you're not going to have that transparency for a certain period of time. So wholesale is another option. Now, if you are very much at the market entry stage, to find the right distributors or agents to take on your brand is also not easy with the fact that you can't travel over there, okay? Normally in the past, pre-COVID, people would go to China, interview 5 to 10 different distributors, kind of figure out what their strengths and weaknesses were, maybe sign contracts with 1 or 2 or sign an exclusive agreement with one of them. But you've seen them face to face, you've shaken hands, you've seen their operations, and you get more of a stronger feeling of what they do. That's less possible nowadays. So I do see the tendency of companies not willing to sign distribution agreements until they have physically gotten on the ground and seen the operations themselves. The last form of trade is retail. Now, with the pandemic, with the recent lockdowns, retail is becoming a very old-fashioned form of operation in China. If anything, and I will highlight this in the case studies, retail should really be your last addition, last phase to your business model. And I will also explain what companies are doing, where they are doing actually e-retail, creating online stores through their own websites, through their own WeChat mini programs. And these stores are becoming these e-stores are actually becoming more valuable than leasing space, having targets that the malls put on you, not being able to afford rent, etc. And I'll explain that through a case study as well to show you a little bit about what's going on. Now, I do just want to highlight that the business models I'm going to show you in the next chapter of this session, I cannot show you 100 of different business models of all the clients that I've had. So I've generalized it to show you starting points and how companies have grown. You have to realize that you have to take business models and create it to you, right? To your product category, to your risk your commitment to risk, your commitment to the market, your financial resources, your HR resources, etc. So I just want to give that disclaimer. I'm not going to show you, hundreds of different business models. I'm going to show you 4 to 5 that you get an idea of how you can progress in China and how you can create a business model that goes from cross-border e-commerce to wholesale distribution to even a strategic partnership with investors in China. Okay, because that is also a trend that I am seeing now. So let's focus a little bit on the business models. Now, you might all be wondering, why have I added Hong Kong? I've added Hong Kong because Hong Kong is not dead yet. Now, what a lot of people are reading in the news is that Hong Kong is obsolete. Nobody is even considering opening up in Hong Kong. What's the point? People want to go direct into China. Now, the issue for me is that Hong Kong's regulations currently under the pandemic are more straightforward, more transparent than they are in China. And I say this out of actual experience, having gone through quarantine in Hong Kong, understanding then what the after quarantine program is, and also just the general life in Hong Kong. It's freer than it is in China. So I have brought up Hong Kong because I still have quite a few brands that are setting up their regional operations in Hong Kong strategically, even though their first step is China. Okay, so you've got your factories globally around the world. Some of you, your factories might be where your HQ is. You're producing your products there. Your Hong Kong company is ultimately buying these products and either selling them to distributors or import agents. What I couldn't add in this diagram is also then creating through Hong Kong your e-commerce, cross-border e-commerce platforms. Tmall Global is headquartered in Hong Kong. JD.com is headquartered in Hong Kong. It also means that you can keep stock in Hong Kong if you like, remembering that Hong Kong is not part of China, so you still have to pay customs duty when it goes into China, but giving you that freedom and flexibility to keep stock there. Now, if China is not your only jurisdiction that you're trying to sell into, but actually you have the intention now or in the future to sell to other APAC regions, you can do that from Hong Kong as well. Okay, so I have highlighted this as a low risk option. Of course, it still costs money to set up a Hong Kong company, to run a Hong Kong company. What many of my clients have done is they have actually set their management in Hong Kong, i.e. the expats, in the last 18 months, because most expats are not willing to go to Shanghai, Beijing, Guangzhou, or Shenzhen, but are willing, even in this pandemic, to go to Hong Kong. And currently the quarantine regulations are 7 days, and there are no compound lockdowns or anything like that. So when you're thinking about where does senior management sit, even if you're hiring them local, they can sit in Hong Kong and still manage your China business, which is your first priority, or expand into the APAC region as well. Okay, so this is a very clean structure. You have one entity in Asia, Hong Kong, that is facilitating partnerships with distributors, import agents, or also setting up the cross-border e-commerce platforms through Tmall Global, JD Global, with thinking in the mind that these service providers are actually in Hong Kong. You will also find that many TPs are also located in Hong Kong, especially those that have the expertise towards the cross-border e-commerce platforms. And you'll also find that there are a lot of logistics providers headquartered in Hong Kong that have extensive warehouses and whatnot in China, but the decision makers are in Hong Kong. So again, it's just strategically that management is in Hong Kong, communicating with the idea to expand then into China and APAC. So this is one form of business model. The other then extension to this, and I've used the UK here so people have a jurisdiction in mind and it becomes a little bit easier to maybe to comprehend, is the following. You maybe are a brand in the UK, you have your headquarters in the UK, and maybe historically you have actually been producing your products in China, or if not in China, maybe in somewhere in the APAC region, okay? And historically, you might have set up a representative office in China to actually handle the sourcing and the production and the quality control of the products that you're producing in China, if not in Asia, okay? Now comes the time where you say, I want to now sell in the region. I want to sell in China and I want to sell into the APAC region, right? Now, many people who don't have structures locally, what they will do is they'll produce in China, it will get exported back to the UK and then re-imported back into China, and you're paying basically logistics costs twice, okay? Now, one thing that you can do is, again, utilize this Hong Kong subsidiary to purchase your products from your suppliers, from whether they're in China or in other APAC regions, and from that Hong Kong company, sell to the PRC distributors or through your cross-border e-commerce model, and then also sell to APAC customers, okay? Now, when the products are actually exported to Hong Kong, it is considered an export, which means that you also do not have to renegotiate with your PRC suppliers, your China suppliers, because for them, they are the exporter of record. They can apply for their VAT refund. Nothing changes to them except the destination. So you're not renegotiating fees. It's all saying the same. It's just that the purchaser is a Hong Kong company instead of a UK company. Okay. So there is more of an advantage from the previous slide. It was really thinking Hong Kong buys from the factory in Europe, US, etc., and is now selling on the cross-border e-commerce platforms and whatnot. Here, it's the fact that there are a lot of you that produce in China. There are a lot of you that produce in Asia. You don't want to send everything back to the UK. You want to keep it on the ground in Asia for sales in Asia, right? And again, one of these options is through this Hong Kong company. The next, and again, this is where you start scaling because the volume of business is there. This is where you start thinking about localizing your business and becoming more domestic. Is the fact that you keep your Hong Kong company, but then you also open a subsidiary in China that purchases from the suppliers in China and sells to the customers in China, either through the e-commerce platforms, but now it's domestic transactions. So it's not cross-border e-commerce, it's domestic e-commerce because the goods never leave China. And then it's also working with distributors, licensees, sales agents throughout the China region. So by having this entity, you are expanding your sales channels extensively. You can already do that from Hong Kong, but you might get more feedback from your customers saying, I want to be invoiced with the local Fapiao system. I want local customer service. I want X, Y, and Z, right? Could also be that in this China subsidiary, you hire now a brand manager, you hire an e-commerce manager, you hire an offline manager that is then catering and is acting as the customer service rep to all of these clients that are already in existence, but also expanding on the clients to new ones. Okay, and Hong Kong basically is in charge of APAC, right? You might eventually feel that in other APAC regions, you need to set up subsidiaries there. I'm not an expert on Vietnam, Malaysia, and all of these places. I'm an expert on China, which is why I've added China into this business model. But that's how you can then expand off of that. Now, what we are also seeing is the fact that many distributors are proactively saying, we're doing so well for your brand in China right now. I actually want a greater piece of the pie and become a strategic Chinese investor for the market. I want to get dividends. I want to get more out of this. And it's not just with Chinese, and it's not just with distributors, but you might also find that you need to have strategic investors in place that have the network to other offline channels, or that might have a network to other APAC regions, depends. Okay, so you might say, actually, we need a joint venture with these investors to add on additional functions, or because of a network, or of course, there could be a monetary aspect where you need capital to grow your business in China. Okay. Now, as you can see from this, I've just expanded on the previous business model to add in this joint venture component, but we can rework the business model and restructure it to make it a little bit cleaner than what it is shown here on this diagram, okay? You can still maintain your Hong Kong subsidiary. In fact, you could also decide that the joint venture should be in Hong Kong instead of in China. You can also turn your existing entity that you set up in China into the joint venture, just adding that investor inside. You could set up a holding company that just holds the investors, because there may be more than one. You might have 2 or 3 that you're interested in adding into the China component. And of course, the question comes, are these investors purely for the Chinese market, or could these be strategic investors that are also valuable for APAC? So when it comes to structuring your business models, these are all the options that you can create. You can have Hong Kong, you can decide, I don't want Hong Kong. You can decide maybe Singapore instead of Hong Kong. It all comes down to what markets are you trying to attract? Where do you want to sit logically? What are the tax optimization aspects that you need to consider based on where your holding jurisdiction is? It could be if you need strategic investors or not. This all plays into it, okay? Which is why I say, usually business models are very much tailor-made to every single company, because they have different holding structures, they have different ownership structures, and they have different goals and objectives for the Chinese market or even for the APAC region. But I'm hoping this can give you a sense of how you can create your business model in the market. Now, a lot of you, like I said, will potentially start your business in China utilizing the cross-border e-commerce model. But as you scale and as you grow, the cross-border e-commerce model is just simply not sustainable. You will need to take that model from being cross-border into being domestic. And I want you all to understand what it takes to go from that level, that business model, to the next, okay? When you're switching from a cross-border model to a domestic model, you have to think about all of the additional sales channels that you can add. Offline, retail. Like I said, retail is becoming old-fashioned. Not really something people want to invest in right now. I assume it's going to come back, but it will come back in a different shape or form, in that it's going to become an experience versus an actual retail store. There was a statistic I heard at a China Britain Business Council conference about 4 weeks ago now. And there was a study done on what are the hobbies of Chinese people. And the number one hobby by far was shopping. It was the fact that people are looking for shopping experiences. And I just actually saw on a WeChat mini program a collaboration between, I believe it's Nike and the Air Force or something like that, where it's an experience where people have to go in, they have to fill out this really cool quiz, and then they get put into a lottery to get these pair of shoes that are worth $3,000 US. I mean, this is an experience. This is an exciting moment to fill out this quiz and these details, get information from your consumers, and then to sell out this pair of sneakers. That's a co-collaboration, I believe, with the Air Force. I believe that's what it was. But these are the types of experiences that people are doing. And this is also why I say retail. You have to think of retail as not just the traditional mall concept, but retail as an e-retail, i.e. WeChat mini programs, creating your own website store in China. Now, if you are also in a product category which requires product registrations in China, this has to get done if you're looking to go domestic. And for some products, you're looking at timelines of between 12 to 18 months, right? So you really need to use the cross-border e-commerce business model as a testing ground to then evaluate when do you actually want to register your products in China, okay? The next thing you want to think about moving from cross-border to domestic is moving certain functions of outsourced providers into an in-house team. Why do I say that? Because every single outsourced provider has its strengths and weaknesses. And for a lot of the e-commerce providers, and again, I'm generalizing here, it's not with everybody, they are not data-centric, meaning that you may want to hire somebody on the ground that actually analyzes the data from your sales, from your costs. We just did that, and I want to explain it in a case study. We just actually went through a hiring of a senior financial analyst whose daily job is analyzing the cross-border e-commerce model. One, to make sure that they continue to be profitable and they make the right profit margins. Two, that they get the right data from the service providers, which is why he's on the ground doing this communication with them. And three, also collaborating with the logistics providers to make sure that there is clear ideas on inventory on the ground, what's moving in, what's working, what's not working, what SKUs have to be sent back, etc. So you may find that you don't have the right people, or that your service providers don't have the right people internally to give you this information. So you may want to hire somebody who does that. More analysis is needed on the ground. I think what a lot of people make the assumption on is that when they develop their trade models, they feel like initially they can just delegate everything out. You can't. Human resource capabilities is a must. You have to know who in your team is going to be responsible for the communication with the different parties. Who's going to analyze the business? Are you analyzing enough? Are you asking the right questions to your providers to get the data that you need? And don't underestimate the analysis that is needed, because cross-border e-commerce, domestic e-commerce, this is a fast-paced business and you have to pivot very, very quickly. You also have to hit these big sales campaigns, 11/11, 6/18, 9/9, Chinese New Year, etc., to make sure that you are bringing on this opportunity, taking advantage of the opportunity that exists there. And then finally, don't underestimate local customer service. Do your distributors provide that? Do your TPs provide that, if at all? Do you need that on the ground? right? Do not underestimate that customer service component. So this is what it really does take to go from a cross-border e-commerce model to a domestic model, right? It's adding on these sales channels and whatnot. Now I want to talk about, I hope I didn't, I believe I missed out, I deleted a slide, but I'll touch on that client. I wanted to go through 4 case studies today because I think it just makes it easier for people to visualize these concepts of business models by really looking at companies and what they have done in the market. So this is a UK leather accessories brand. I'm not permitted to reveal the brand name. They produce in the UK. They are a 3rd generation historical company. And they started selling in China through actually a distributor who lives in Tianjin, but is American. So it's a Western-owned company. And the distributor actually created a strategy for China together with this brand. And the strategy was to go onto 4 different e-commerce platforms. This was in 2018, to go onto 4 different e-commerce platforms and to open up a flagship retail store in Tianjin. Probably not the best location to open up a flagship store, but this is where the distributor was based, and he wanted to control the retail store with the ideas of hopefully expanding then to Shanghai, Beijing, and other areas. Now, this is all pre-pandemic, so it was a totally different retail outlook, and everything was different. Now, the dilemma here is that they went the distribution model. In those days, they were able to fly and back, meet each other. The distributor even flew to the UK, was able to visit the production facility. And ultimately, as the business developed on the e-commerce platforms, as well as through the retail outlet, and keep in mind, there's no product registrations for these types of products, they did very well. What happened? The distributor wanted to retire. So this left the client with the difficulty of pivoting his business. Do I maintain a distributor relationship and find somebody new that maybe is not Western, and maybe I'll have communication barriers, maybe I won't have as much control as I do now, and all of this? Or with the experience that I've learned through the distributor, do I now do it on my own? Their final decision was to do it on their own, where they established their own company in China. They took over the ownership of the e-commerce platforms. They took over the ownership of the retail outlet, and they took over staff from the distributor as well, with whom they've already had, what was it, about 2-3 years of relationship. Then came the pandemic in 2020. And the outcome of this client was the fact that e-commerce boomed tremendously because everybody was buying online. And in 2020, it was not like the lockdown that happened this year. People were still able, couriers were still delivering products. There was still movement. There was still the flexibility of things moving around compared to this year. But what they realized was retail was a crash. It was an absolute disaster. They then decided to close retail, focus purely on e-commerce. They had the intention in 2022 to think about opening retail, but in a more strategic location. But lo and behold, there came the further lockdowns, which were even more outrageous compared to 2020. So again, they're at a stage now where retail is not even an option. They're maintaining their e-commerce platforms, and they're focusing now on 11/11 for a huge pickup. Now, if it were me, I would have said, don't bother with Tianjin. They know Tianjin is not a strategic location. However, they didn't want to rock the boat in terms of staff, and the staff were based in Tianjin. So that was ultimately their objective and their goal. So they have nothing in Hong Kong. They went direct into China, working with this distributor, and they kept their entire business model in China. Now, for the second half of the year, they are focusing actually on getting a strategic Chinese investor into the business. However, not just into the China business, but also into the UK business. They believe that Hong Kong, the UK and China are one, it's one team, and they would like the investors to be part of the overall brand development globally. So that's their intention now. They've actually pinpointed an investor. He's already come on board in the UK, and now they're thinking about how to potentially restructure the China business in order to benefit from this partnership. So again, this is a company, had nothing to do with Hong Kong, went straight to China, worked with a distributor, pivoted the business to have their own organization, and now are looking for investors. The next company I want to talk to is, again, a UK brand that is a coffee, tea, hot chocolate, cookies brand. They have been selling into China for the last 10 years, again, through a distribution model. Exclusivity with a distributor, but great relationship to the point where the distributor actually approached them to expand the sales channels to online e-commerce. They thought, fantastic, this guy will do everything. And also the distributor put in the financial investment into the online aspect. So actually the brand did not pay for anything in terms of the startup costs of the online business model. The inventory was already on the ground. Inventory was already, all the products were already registered because they're food and beverage items. And they just expanded. Now, over time, they realized that the distributor was asking way too many questions about marketing initiatives, online marketing initiatives, media initiatives, and they were realizing that potentially this is not his strength. So they actually seconded a staff from the UK to China, who actually became employed by the distributor, to take the weaknesses away from the distributor, bring that, if you would like, in-house to this individual, who became then in charge of all the marketing, branding, media campaigns, particularly for the online. But in the discovery of all of this process, it was also shown what other weaknesses the distributor has, because they had somebody on the ground, if you will, spying. And they also then pivoted their business to the fact that they wanted to not exit the relationship, but just build the team through their own entity in China, and to think of more creative ways to give shopping experiences to consumers through the idea of pop-up stores, etc. So that's the route they've gone. They've actually set up their own entity. They brought in the full e-commerce business in-house. The distribution to supermarket chains and retail outlets is still through that old distributor. But again, I want people to understand that this was a 6-year process of discovery by having this person on the ground and realizing the strengths and weaknesses of the distributor. But it's also to show that nobody is just choosing one type of sales model. This is a combination of e-commerce, offline, and the idea of setting up pop-up stores, i.e. retail, throughout China. The next case study I want to highlight is through a German chocolate company, where they've been in China for about 10 years, working with a variety of different distributors offline. But again, nothing really has kicked off, and they never really focused on e-commerce. And on top of that, the distributors never offered to do e-commerce. So they decided to build a team on the ground to facilitate this, seconding an individual to China, and then hiring a marketing manager and an e-commerce manager to manage this. Again, they still have to use TPs to do the fulfillment, the media agencies to build up the branding and the campaigns. But through their research, through their product testing, they also discovered that what they are currently selling in the market does not fit the market. They then focused on doing focus group studies, further market research, data mining, tasting tests, etc., and realized that they have to create a different product design to fulfill the Chinese market. And this is something that they are now launching through their own entity again, through their own team. Now, I am highlighting companies that have the financial resources and the HR resources to back all of this. I also want to mention that they're realizing what financial resources are required to actually kick this off, what HR resources are required to kick this off. This is not just a matter of delegating. If you want to be successful in China, you need the team to back you up, and you need the capital to back you up as well. So with them, they have no intention of getting strategic investors. They have absolutely no intention of becoming partners with the distributors. Their intention is ultimately to create these new product packaging that will fit ultimately the Chinese market. So again, they've pivoted to go from the traditional distribution model to the retail. Now, the next case study, and unfortunately I don't have the photo of this, is a company that is part of the group Mariposa, which is a very large Latin American group. I'm allowed to tell you their name. I'm a non-executive on their China board, where they are actually focused purely initially on cross-border e-commerce. Why? Because they've only just entered the market a year ago. Now, their intention is to focus on cross-border e-commerce. They are on Tmall Global. They are on JD Global as well. And they have had an extremely successful year, to the point where they have actually decided to have a Hong Kong company. They have seconded 2 individuals to be in Hong Kong. This is the client that just hired a financial analyst, also in Hong Kong, because they want this person to sit with the decision makers. They have an e-commerce manager in China, a marketing manager in China, a supply chain manager in China. And they're only just kicking off. And again, this is a company with the financial resources to back this up. But they have a very ambitious plan to bring in 4 to 5 brands that they own. They are a huge conglomerate. They own 40, 50 beverage brands. They also own 20 to 25 snack brands. And their incentive, their goal is to bring 4 to 5 brands into China per year, do A/B testing on the cross-border e-commerce models for a period of 9 to 10 months. They want people on the ground to do the analytical work so that they can pivot very, very quickly to understand what SKUs are working, what SKUs are not working. Do they have to change flavors? Do they have to change packaging? Do they have to change e-commerce platforms? They are now thinking of actually opening a 3rd e-commerce platform on Douyin, which is becoming much, much more popular than Tmall and JD. They have decided that they will also start doing offline with one of their brands. They've registered the product. They're in the process of registering the 2nd product. They are making decisions daily, and it is phenomenal to watch, because with most Western brands, the decision-making process takes forever. And it's one of my first clients in 18 years where I see them pivoting weekly, because they are getting data straight away. They're analyzing the data straight away, and they have enough information to know how to pivot, how to move. And they don't have to go through a whole hierarchy of decision-making people to make decisions. They are standalone in Asia to progress. And it is bringing phenomenal results, so that they are able to add headcount, and they're able to actually physically expand into China, register their products, and start approaching distributors, because they have a history, a track record of their flagship stores online. They also have acquired phenomenal brand ambassadors. They have used KOLs to such success that even the distributors are aware of the KOLs promoting their products. So because of this track record, they are able now to approach distributors who are interested to bring their products offline. Now, this is also something, an interesting point to realize, is that historically, with these 3 other clients that I was talking to you about, pre-COVID, but even longer before that, distributors were happy to take on any forms of clients. Nowadays, distributors, especially for offline, are much more selective on who they want to take on as clients, much more selective. And as a result of that, They want to see a track record of existing sales to understand whether the brand is successful, whether people are talking about it, is there brand awareness, are there KOLs that are being used and which KOLs are being used, so that it makes it easier for them to bring the products offline. It's a very different pivot in the distribution world. This is also why I say, and I said it at the beginning of the presentation, the trend right now is brands using cross-border e-commerce as their first point of entry into China to build up a track record so that they get the attention of the distributors. It's very rare to find distributors that are going to approach you unless they have truly niched their product categories themselves. So I do want you all to be aware of that. So this is just to say that with Believe and BIA, this group Mariposa, they are going to bring in 4 to 5 brands a year. The expectation is that at least 2 or 3 of those brands will succeed. The other 2 will be dropped out. They will then increase their marketing expenditure, start product registrations, and register those products in China so that they can bring it offline. Their goal is also to get strategic investors on board, not for the financial aspect. It is actually more for the networking and the connections that these strategic investors will have to retail chains, supermarkets, and whatnot. But also if these Chinese investors have a network then to other retail outlets in APAC, because their obvious goal after China is to go into Southeast Asia and build up that market as well. So they really have the vision of APAC as whole, with China being jurisdiction number 1. Now, for some of you, you might be thinking, oh, we're so small and none of this will apply to us. It could very well be. Like I have said, business models need to be tailor-made to your commitment level to the market, to your risk level, to the financial resources you have at your fingertips, and to also the human resources you have at your fingertips that can build up this business. Doesn't mean that something cannot be created for you. I just want you to realize that it is always tailor-made. These are 4 companies, 3 of which are in the F&B sector, that have very different ambitions and goals and are doing their business in a very different way, okay? Based on the market research that they've done, based on focus groups that they have spoken to, etc. So it has to be tailor-made to what you are looking to do, what you're looking to achieve. So that's the end of today's presentation, to give you an idea that when you are thinking long-term about your strategy in China, and when you're trying to tap into the trade opportunity, to sum up, the number 1 trend is cross-border e-commerce. If you already have great distributors, see if they can help you to go that route. The other trend is then adding the offline aspect with distributors and ultimately thinking of shopping experiences through retail, but not through the traditional retail route. It's through this new retail that everybody is talking about. I would love to hear what your biggest takeaway was from today. And if you've got any questions, please do add them into the chat box. Just to finish up today's session, here are the ways we can help. The biggest thing I hope you get out of this is we do help with validating your China market entry strategy, giving you the pros and cons of what you can and cannot do. And then we also provide implementation services if you're looking to actually physically get on the ground in China. If you're interested in creating your trade model in China, or you want to have questions or bounce back ideas, happy to have a conversation. You can email me at Kristina@woodburnglobal.com. And just to finish off, we are going to start our next round of roundtables on the 31st of August. I just checked the calendar. It's not September 1st. It's Wednesday, the 31st of August, where we'll have a new series of topics for the fall period, all around HR issues. We're also going to be talking about actual business issues around profit margins, brand disruption, and all of these fun topics. So stay tuned for the list of roundtable topics. And in the meantime, I want to wish everybody a very happy summer holiday. And I look forward to seeing you again at the end of August. Take care and goodbye.